what does it mean by swimming in the ocean of trauma? Why was this something that we thought was um, worth mentioning when we're talking about trauma?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole. It's great to be here and it's great to see so many faces. And yeah, I think when we're looking at this title, oftentimes when we think about trauma, we think of the kind of smaller population of people who've experienced trauma, and then there's me or there's us and the other group of people. But it's kind of shifting the context to not about the smaller population of people who've experienced trauma, but really expanding into how is our culture and our society informed by trauma, and that really we're actually swimming in the after effects of a traumatized world. We're actually born into a world of trauma. And so in many ways we're swimming in it, but I love the story where there's two fish swimming in an ocean and they swim by in the ocean, and then an older fish comes up to them and the older fish asks the two younger fish, he says, "How's the water, boys?" And then the two fish say, "The water's great." And then as they're swimming along later on, one of the two
One of
fish turns to the other fish and he says, "What in the world is water?" And so it's kind of like we're swimming in it, but we don't realize that we're swimming in it. So in many ways, it's like the air that we breathe. And so yeah, that's kind of
Yeah,
my
that's kind of
and, yeah, Chris, is there anything you'd like to add about it?
Oh, yeah, I think just to share again and add, I think the more that we learn about trauma and explore trauma and learn to recognize the effects of trauma and trauma patterns in ourselves and in our surroundings around us, the more that we begin to see that it's exactly that, that we're born into a traumatized world, or a world of where there's been transgression after transgression for generations and hundreds of years, thousands of years. And so we live in a traumatized world, and the systems that we live in are often bedded from trauma, and there's trauma within and come from trauma. And so it's the water that we swim in. And we begin to see that more and more the more that we learn about trauma and feel its effects and learn how to work with the effects.
Yeah. And so I think it isn't to like spread doom and gloom over the whole situation, like there's trauma everywhere and we're swimming in it and we can't get out of it, but more of a sense to begin to take an honest look at how pervasive the influence and impact of trauma is in our systems, in our society, and in our families, and in our lives. And also that brings a lot of hope because that also in our growing awareness of that, we begin to digest, become more informed, and actually the trauma kind of digest as ethical understanding and ethical wisdom as a society and also as people. So yeah, yeah, that's I think what comes into the name.
Thank you. And so what I'm also hearing, and I know you said it, but is we have to say something if it's on our lung, it's on our tongue, But what I also get from all of this is it's not just about something that happened to you. So often when we think about trauma, and I kind of think that the word trauma is now used so liberally in everyday language now, but typically it's to identify a highly stressful event that has happened to someone. But what I'm also hearing you say is that it's intergenerational. It may not have actually happened to you in person, but there've been generations if in your family, that so you're also not just swimming in the ocean, you actually unwittingly and unconsciously actually born into it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so I think in understanding trauma is not just the event that happens to you, it's what happens inside you with that
Mhm.
event. And what you're touching on, Nicole, is like epigenetics or intergenerational trauma, which is, I think, particularly it's being researched in many different universities, but particularly in France. I believe it's University of Paris, where they've been doing tests on rats, and they found that over 9 generations of rats, if there's a first rat they exposed to trauma, then that rat, the mother, develops a lower immune response, also has different behavioral changes in the way that she moves and walks. And then her children, even though they haven't been exposed to the same trauma, I believe it's like electrical shock, the children experience the same decreased immunity and also the same behavioral symptoms that the mother experienced. And that those symptoms are passed that show up up to already 9 generations in rats. And so that's just on a genetic level, how trauma is passed down. And so obviously that study isn't being done on humans, but there's a lot that's being inferred and implied as we're looking at the research that's developed around what is being passed on through our genes, which before we thought was just a behavioral transmission through kind of like nurturing in our childhood, but are also learning that there's even an aspect that is passed through genetically. So that's kind of an emerging field that's quite interesting to look at.
I can tell you, being an animal lover and vegetarian, I kind of want to get into a plankton and free those poor rats right now. But yeah, it is such an interesting area on in trauma and understanding it. So thank you for explaining the swimming in the ocean of trauma and why we decided to use that as a title.